The Last Witness by Sasha. Chapter 1. The Unseen Eyes. The night had been unusually cold for early spring, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and wouldn't let go. Emily Harris huddled deeper into her coat as she walked along the dimly lit street, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement in a rhythm that matched her unease. The city around her seemed oddly quiet for a Thursday evening. No chatter from the bars, no music drifting from the clubs, not even the usual hum of cars passing by. It was as though the entire world had taken a collective breath and was holding it in anticipation. She had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. A glance toward the alleyway on her left caught her attention. A flicker of movement. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat, but the figure was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. Emily's stomach churned, and her instincts screamed at her to keep walking, to not stop and wonder, to get home and forget the strange feeling gnawing at her gut. But that's when she saw it. A flash of silver, a glint of something sharp under the dim glow of the streetlight. The sound of a muffled scream followed, and then the unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the shadows of the alley, a man stood over another figure, the victim crumpled at his feet, motionless. Emily froze, her feet refusing to obey her mind. She wanted to turn and run, but the scene before her had her rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was witnessing. A cold, eerie sensation crawled up her spine as the man, dressed in dark clothing, glanced over his shoulder. His eyes locked onto hers for a brief moment, just long enough for her to catch the chill of recognition that he saw her. No worse. He knew she saw him before Emily could react. The man turned swiftly, disappearing into the night, vanishing as though he'd never been there. The victim, was it a man? Lay in the alley motionless, his blood staining the concrete in dark streaks. Panic surged through Emily as her legs finally found the strength to move. She ran, her breath ragged and heart pounding in her chest. The image of the body, the look in the man's eyes, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The police were called. Detectives were dispatched. Emily gave her statement, repeating the same words over and over as if to convince herself more than anyone else. "I didn't see his face, just his eyes," she had told Detective Stone, his gruff voice cutting through her every sentence like a knife. "It all happened so fast. I didn't even think. I had to get away. She had faltered, the memory choking her. She hadn't even caught her breath before she was ushered out of the scene. As she sat in her apartment later that night, staring out the window at the empty street below, the memory of the man's cold eyes lingered, as if they were following her. The city's lights seemed too bright, the shadows too long. Emily tried to shake it off, tried to tell herself it wasn't her problem. She was just a witness, someone who had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. But she knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. There was something far bigger at play here, something that didn't stop with the crime in the alley, something she hadn't yet fully understood. The phone rang. Emily jumped, her heart racing. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice tight. "Miss Harris," a voice said, smooth and professional. "We need to talk." Her blood ran cold. Something in that voice, calm and calculating, made her instincts scream. Before she could speak, the line went dead. She held the phone to her ear for several long seconds, as if hoping the person would speak again. But there was nothing. The room felt too small now. The walls pressed in, suffocating. Emily dropped the phone onto the coffee table, her hands trembling. She had no idea who had been on the other end of the line, but she knew, without a doubt, that she wasn't going to get the luxury of forgetting what she had witnessed. The darkness in the alleyway wasn't done with her. The man's cold eyes were still watching. And now, whoever had just called was about to drag her deeper into a web of lies that she would never be able to untangle. Emily had become a pawn in a game she never intended to play, and the worst part, she wasn't sure who the real enemy was anymore. The killer? The phone call? Or was it something darker? Something far more sinister than she could comprehend. The answers, she knew, would cost her everything. As the hours ticked by and Emily struggled to find sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the city itself had become an enemy. Every creak of the building, every distant noise outside felt like a threat, an omen that something was closing in on her. She tried to convince herself that it was just paranoia, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. A knock at the door sent her heart into her throat. She stood frozen, listening. Was it the police? Another detective? Her breath was shallow as she moved cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. But as her fingers brushed against the handle, she felt it, the unmistakable presence of something watching her. Turning, she saw the reflection of her own face in the glass of the window, but it wasn't the only thing she saw. In the shadows behind her, a figure stood, barely visible, his eyes catching the light for just a moment. The man from the alley, her pulse hammered in her ears. The nightmare was far from over, and this time, it was only getting worse. Chapter 2. The Watcher. The morning light barely pierced through the blinds, casting narrow beams of pale sunlight across the floor of Emily's apartment. Her eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, the fear of being watched still gripping her chest. She hadn't been able to shake the image of that figure standing behind her in the reflection. The man, the killer, his cold eyes still haunted her thoughts, and the phone call lingered in her mind like a bad taste she couldn't swallow. She had hoped it was just a bad dream, but the unease gnawing at her gut told her otherwise. Sitting at the small kitchen table, Emily stared into her coffee cup, trying to push away the panic that bubbled up inside her. It was foolish, she told herself. She was just a witness. She had seen something, but she hadn't seen enough. Surely they would catch the guy. The police were investigating, right? She grabbed her phone and pulled up the detective's contact information. Detective Stone. A man with a reputation for getting things done, or so she had been told. She had spoken to him once, giving her statement in a blur of fear and confusion. There was no way to know if he would be able to connect her sighting to anything concrete, but she had to try. Her finger hovered over the dial button for a moment before she pressed it, the ringback tone echoing through the silence of the room. Detective Stone, came the gruff voice on the other end. Detective, it's Emily Harris. From last night, the woman who saw the man in the alley. I'm just wondering if there's been any progress. Ms. Harris. Stone's voice was curt, professional. We're looking into it. There's not much to go on right now, but we've got some leads. I'll keep you posted. Emily sighed, though she wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed. It wasn't enough. She needed more. She had seen something important, and now she couldn't forget it. She couldn't leave it behind and move on with her life, no matter how hard she tried. She hung up the phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before shaking her head. She was just another witness, another insignificant person in a city full of crimes and chaos. But the phone call, who had it been? Why did they want to talk to her? She knew it wasn't just coincidence. A sudden knock at her door broke through her thoughts, sharp and insistent. Emily's heart leapt into her throat, her body freezing in place. For a moment, she wondered if she should ignore it, but the fear that the man from the alley was out there watching her made her hesitate. Who could it be? Slowly, she stood up and approached the door, her hand trembling as she grasped the knob. She peered through the peephole. There was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. She wasn't alone. Someone was out there. Someone was watching her. Her phone rang again. This time the caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" she answered, her voice shaking. "Ms. Harris, I'm glad you picked up." The voice on the other end said, smooth and cold, "I hope I didn't startle you. It's time we had a real conversation." Emily's pulse raced as she heard the words. Her mind scrambled for a response, but she could only manage a breathless, "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer right away, but there was a faint sound on the other end of the line, like a soft chuckle. "Don't play coy with me, Emily. You know who I am." Her stomach dropped. The tone of the voice, so familiar and yet so chilling, sent a wave of dread through her. "You've seen something you shouldn't have," the voice continued, the words sharp and deliberate. "And now I think we need to make sure you don't tell anyone about it. You wouldn't want your little life to get messy, would you? What do you want?" Emily whispered, her hands clammy as she gripped the phone. "I want you to understand, Emily," the voice purred, "that you're in far deeper than you think. It's not just the man in the alley. There's more to this, much more. And if you want to make it out alive, you need to stop looking. Stop asking questions." The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone in her hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had no idea who had just threatened her, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't back down. The cryptic words swirled in her mind. What was this man talking about? What did he mean by more? Suddenly, the silence in her apartment felt oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with an unseen presence. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was undeniable now. She had to act. She couldn't sit back and wait for someone else to solve this. She needed answers. Later that afternoon, Emily made her way to the local library, her steps quick and purposeful. If the police weren't going to help her, she would have to help herself. The man's words echoed in her mind. He had known she was asking questions, and she hadn't even scratched the surface. What had she really seen in that alley? Who was the man, and why was he watching her? The library was quiet, a place where she could dig into the past without anyone noticing her. She needed to know more about the neighborhood where the crime had happened, any unsolved cases or strange occurrences that could be connected to what she had witnessed. Emily found a seat at a table near the back of the room, and soon, her fingers flew over the keyboard of one of the library's public computers. She pulled up news articles from the past few months, trying to find any mention of the alley or the surrounding area. She skimmed through local crime reports, each one more mundane than the last: petty theft, car break-ins, a few assaults, but nothing that seemed to connect to her case. Until she saw it. A news headline from 2 years ago. Unsolved murder haunts the old district. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the link. The article described a gruesome murder that had occurred in the very same neighborhood, right down the street from where she had witnessed the crime. A young woman had been found dead, her body dumped in an alley, her throat slashed. The case had gone cold. No suspects, no answers. Emily leaned closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the details. The description of the victim, her name was Caroline Davis, struck a chord deep within her. She didn't know why, but something about the woman's face in the accompanying photo seemed familiar. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Could it be? Could the two events, Caroline's murder and the one she had witnessed, be connected? It was the only lead she had, and now it seemed like she had no choice but to follow it, wherever it might lead. Chapter 3: Unraveling Threads. Emily's mind raced as she stared at the photo of Caroline Davis on the screen. There was no logical reason for it, but something about the woman's face struck her. A sensation of familiarity that she couldn't shake. She clicked on the article to read more about the unsolved murder, but the words blurred as her thoughts collided with a sense of mounting urgency. Could the two crimes be related? And why did Caroline's name seem so familiar? She had seen too many news stories, too many cases, to become paranoid about a coincidence. But her instincts were warning her. There was something bigger at play. The phone call, the dark figure in the alley. It was all too much to ignore now. Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then she typed in a search query for Caroline Davis's name. The next set of results was a mix of articles, mostly repeating the same facts, but one in particular caught her attention. It was a local news story from the time of Caroline's death, and it included a chilling detail. A witness had seen a man leaving the scene just before the body was discovered. The witness had been too scared to come forward, and the police had never been able to locate them. Her heart skipped. This was it, the missing piece. She clicked on the article, scanning through the words quickly. The witness had never been identified, but there was a description. A tall man, wearing a dark coat and a strange, unsettling air about him. The police had called him a person of interest, but the investigation had hit a wall. No one had ever come forward to provide more information, and the case had gone cold. Emily leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. A witness had seen someone leaving the scene. Why hadn't the police found them? Was this all part of a cover-up? A sudden noise from behind made her jump. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood near the library entrance, just within her line of sight. A man wearing a dark coat. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as he seemed to look right at her, though she couldn't make out his features from where she sat. His presence felt strange, almost as if he were waiting for something. But before she could gather her thoughts, he turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the street outside. Emily's pulse raced, and she quickly stood, her legs trembling. Was that the man? The one she'd seen in the alley? It had to be a coincidence, but the feeling that something was wrong clawed at her insides. She didn't wait around to question her instincts. With her heart pounding, she grabbed her purse and headed for the exit, her mind already racing ahead to the next step. She needed to find out who Caroline had been, what had happened in the days leading up to her death. But more than that, she needed to know why she was being dragged into this. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Emily glanced up and down the street, half expecting to see the man from the library. But he was gone, just a shadow in her mind now. She swallowed hard and forced herself to focus. She needed answers. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. She fumbled for it, her hand shaking as she read the message. It was from Detective Stone. "We need to talk. Meet me at the precinct in 1 hour." Her stomach clenched. Why now? What had happened? Emily didn't waste time. She hailed a cab, her mind spinning with questions she didn't have answers for. Had the police found something? Had they connected the dots between Caroline's murder and the crime she had witnessed? She had no idea, but she wasn't about to sit idly by. As the cab sped through the city, Emily's thoughts flickered back to the library. The man in the dark coat. Was it just a coincidence? And why had he seemed to be watching her? Was it just her paranoia? Or was someone truly following her? When the cab arrived at the precinct, Emily paid the driver and stepped out, her nerves on edge. She had been here before, but never with the feeling of dread that gripped her now. The building loomed ahead, imposing and gray, a place of answers and perhaps more questions. She entered the front door and made her way toward the elevators, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. Detective Stone was waiting for her in a small, sterile interrogation room, his face serious as he gestured for her to sit. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice firm. "We've got a lead." Emily's heart skipped. "A lead?" He nodded. "It's not much, but we've been able to tie your statement to some recent developments. You mentioned seeing the man in the alley, the same man who was involved in the murder of Caroline Davis." Her breath caught. "What? How do you know that?" Stone's eyes darkened. "We didn't realize it at first, but there's a connection. We found footage from a security camera near the alley where you were, and it shows a man wearing the same coat and the same height. We also found footage from another nearby camera showing him in the vicinity of Caroline's murder." Emily could barely breathe. "So, the man I saw, he's the same one who killed Caroline?" Stone didn't respond immediately, his gaze narrowing as he folded his arms. "We don't know for sure yet, but the evidence is starting to point in that direction. We think you may have witnessed a connection between both crimes." Emily's mind raced. "But why would he come after me? What did I see that's so important?" "We're still working on that," Stone said. "But there's something else you need to know. He paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. The witness we were looking for, the one who saw the man leaving Caroline's murder scene, we believe they were close to discovering something. Something bigger than just a murder. Emily's stomach twisted. What do you mean? What was so important about that murder? Stone looked at her carefully. I can't say too much right now, but what I can tell you is that the people involved in Caroline's death, and likely in the crime you witnessed, are not who they appear to be. This isn't just a string of isolated events. It's all part of something larger. She felt a chill run down her spine. The walls seemed to close in around her. Who are we dealing with here, detective? Stone's eyes met hers, filled with an unreadable expression. That's what we're about to find out, and I think you've just become the key to unraveling it all. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized the magnitude of what she had stepped into. The conspiracy was far bigger than she had ever imagined. And now, she was right in the center of it. She had no choice but to keep digging, to keep following the threads of the web she had unwittingly stumbled into. But she also knew one thing. She was no longer just a witness. She was a target. And if she wasn't careful, she might be the next victim. Chapter 4. Shadows in the dark. The walls of the precinct seemed to close in around Emily as Detective Stone's words echoed in her mind. She had become the key, the unwitting player in a game she didn't understand, a game that had already cost one life, and was threatening to take hers as well. As she sat across from Stone, she tried to focus, her mind reeling with the implications of what he had just told her. She was no longer just a reporter. She was tangled in a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple murder. Powerful figures were involved, people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And she had seen too much. The detective's gaze remained fixed on her, his sharp eyes watching her closely. Are you sure you're okay, Miss Harris? Emily blinked, coming back to the present. She hadn't realized how much her hands were shaking until she tried to steady them on the table. I'm fine, she said, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. What happens now? Stone leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. We need to get you out of here. It's not safe anymore. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to come after you. Who are they? Emily asked, her voice barely a murmur. She had to know. She had to understand what kind of people she was dealing with. Stone's face darkened. I can't say much right now, but we believe it's a network of corrupt officials. Politicians, law enforcement, maybe even higher-ups in the business world. They've managed to cover their tracks for years, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets hidden. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The stakes were higher than she had thought. So Caroline's death, it wasn't random. Definitely not, Stone replied, shaking his head. Caroline was involved in something she shouldn't have been, and we think she was close to uncovering something big. Something that could bring all of them down. Emily's thoughts raced. Caroline's death had been no accident, no random act of violence. The people behind it had known exactly what they were doing. But what had Caroline discovered? What had she uncovered that had made her a target? And why did the killer seem to be following Emily now? I need to talk to Caroline's family, Emily said, her voice suddenly firm. I need to know more about her, about what she was involved in. Stone looked hesitant, but after a moment he nodded. I can arrange that, but I'm warning you, be careful. If these people know you're looking into Caroline's life, you could be next. They don't play by the rules. I'm not backing down, Emily replied, her determination hardening. If Caroline was murdered because of what she knew, then I need to find out what it was. I can't let her death be in vain. Stone gave her a long, assessing look before standing up. I'll set up the meeting with her family. But remember, you're not in this alone anymore. We'll do what we can to protect you, but you need to stay low and stay smart. Emily nodded, standing up as well. The weight of what she was about to get into settled heavily on her shoulders, but she had no choice. The answers she needed were buried in the past, and she was determined to dig them out, no matter the cost. Later that evening, Emily sat in her apartment, trying to clear her mind. The walls felt like they were closing in. The city outside was still, its skyline outlined in dim lights, but inside her apartment, the air was thick with tension. Every creak, every distant sound felt amplified as her nerves frayed. She glanced at her phone again. No messages, no calls. She had expected something from Stone, some kind of confirmation or update, but nothing had come through. Her mind kept returning to that moment in the precinct, to the cold reality of what she had learned. She wasn't just chasing a story anymore. She was in the middle of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The knock at the door came suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. Her heart leapt in her chest as she glanced toward the peephole. No one was supposed to be here. No one but. She hesitated, then slowly opened the door, her pulse quickening. It was Detective Stone. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. You need to come with me, he said quietly. It's not safe here. They know you're looking into Caroline's murder. Emily didn't question him. She grabbed her bag, her instincts telling her it was better to follow him than to stay put. She stepped out of the apartment, the door clicking shut behind her, and they moved quickly down the hall. What's going on? Emily asked as they walked briskly toward the stairwell. They've been tracking you, Stone said, his voice low. We got a tip from one of our sources. They know you've been asking questions. We don't know how, but they're on to you. We need to get you out of here now. Emily's mind raced as she followed him down the narrow stairwell. She had known it was only a matter of time before they came for her. But to hear it from Stone made everything feel more real. The threat wasn't just a distant possibility anymore. It was here, closing in. They reached the street, and Stone motioned for her to get into a car parked nearby. Without hesitation, Emily climbed into the passenger seat, her breath shallow. She had no idea where they were going, but she trusted Stone. At least for now. As they drove through the city, the tension between them was palpable. Emily couldn't help but wonder if the people behind Caroline's murder were the same ones who were pulling the strings now. Were they really that powerful, that well-connected? Could Stone even be trusted? Or was he part of the web himself? She glanced at him, her suspicions bubbling beneath the surface. Who can I trust, Detective? She asked, her voice tight. Is there anyone who isn't involved in this? Stone didn't answer immediately. his hands gripping the wheel with a steady intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice hardening. "You can trust me. I'm not the enemy here, but everyone else? I don't know." Emily's heart pounded. She was no longer sure who the enemy was, and as the city lights blurred by in the darkened streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was always watching. The game had changed, and now it was a fight for survival. Chapter 5. The Hidden Truth. The city stretched out before Emily like an endless maze, its dim lights casting long shadows as Detective Stone's car moved through the quiet streets. Every turn felt deliberate, calculated, as though they were being led into a place where the truth could no longer hide. Stone remained focused on the road, his face taut with concentration. Emily sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, a tension that seemed to echo louder than anything they could say. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. She needed answers, but the uncertainty of what was ahead made her anxious. Stone didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened as he glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "We're going to a safe house," he said finally. "It's the only place where we can talk without being watched. They know too much about you already." Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. She had known her investigation into Caroline's death would lead her to dark places, but she hadn't realized how deep the rabbit hole went. People had died because of what they knew, and now, it seemed, she was next in line. "Do you think they're really watching me?" she asked, a part of her wanting reassurance, the other part knowing it wouldn't come. "Who are these people?" Stone's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles going white. "I don't know for sure, but whoever they are, they have eyes everywhere. I can't tell you how I know, but there are people on the inside, people who've been feeding them information. We're going to have to be careful who we trust from here on out." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. But she needed the truth, and she wasn't about to back down. Not when she was this close to uncovering something that could change everything. "Is this about the murder?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is Caroline's death part of something bigger?" Stone hesitated before answering. "Yes, but it's more than just the murder. It's about the people who want to keep their power hidden at any cost. Caroline was just the tip of the iceberg. You're asking questions that they don't want answered. And if you keep digging, you'll find out exactly what they're willing to do to stop you." The weight of his words settled in Emily's chest, and for a moment, she felt a pang of fear. But it wasn't fear that made her pause. It was the sharp, unrelenting determination that had been building in her since the moment she saw Caroline's body. She wouldn't back down now, not when the stakes were this high. They pulled into a narrow alleyway, the entrance to an underground garage hidden from view. The building was old, its brick walls covered in grime, but it felt secure, isolated. Exactly what they needed. Stone led her through the dimly lit halls of the building, past locked doors and empty hallways. The atmosphere was tense, as though the walls themselves held secrets. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they reached a small, unmarked door at the end of a corridor. "This is it," Stone said, unlocking the door with a key from his pocket. He pushed it open, revealing a small, Spartan room. A bed in the corner, a table, and a few chairs. The windows were covered with thick blinds, and the only light came from a low-hanging bulb in the center of the ceiling. Emily stepped inside, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. She had no idea how long she would be here, but she knew it wouldn't be long enough for her to uncover all the answers. The room felt like a temporary refuge, a holding cell where the truth would either be revealed or buried forever. Stone closed the door behind them and leaned against it. "We'll have a couple of hours here. I'll get some rest. But I want you to think about everything you know about Caroline's murder. Everything. The smallest detail could help us piece this together." Emily nodded, her mind already working through the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. Caroline had been more than just a victim. She had been involved in something that had made her a target. And now, Emily was wrapped up in it, whether she wanted to be or not. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steady. Stone looked at her, his gaze sharp. "You keep digging. You need to talk to Caroline's family, find out if she had any enemies, and you need to stay alert. If they're watching you, they're also watching the people you're close to. That includes me." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "What about the people who are behind all this? How do we find them?" Stone's lips tightened into a thin line. "That's the hard part. We don't know who they are. Not yet, but we're getting closer. I've got some contacts who can help us, but it's going to take time. And we don't have much time." Emily hated that word. She didn't have time to waste. Not when people were willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. "Do you think Caroline knew who they were?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stone's expression softened for a moment. "I think she was starting to put the pieces together. That's why she was killed. But if we're going to solve this, we need to be smarter than they are. And we need to move fast." Emily felt a cold knot of fear settle in her stomach. She had no idea how deep this conspiracy went, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just Caroline's life at risk anymore. It was hers, too. And if she wasn't careful, she might be the next person to disappear. The next few hours passed in tense silence. Emily sat by the window, watching the city outside, trying to think through the next steps. Her mind kept returning to Caroline, the woman who had been so close to uncovering the truth. But now Emily had to carry that weight alone. The question was, could she survive long enough to find the answers? The door opened again, and Stone stepped inside, his face grim. "We've got a lead," he said, his voice low. "But we have to move quickly. There's no time to waste." Emily stood up, her heart racing. She was about to step into the heart of the storm, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The safe house felt colder now, the air thick with the weight of unanswered questions and the distant hum of the city outside. The urgency in Detective Stone's voice had shaken Emily, though she hid it behind a mask of determination. She needed answers. She had to understand what Caroline had discovered, and why someone had gone to such lengths to silence her. Stone had barely said a word since his arrival in the room. He was pacing back and forth, his brow furrowed, clearly lost in thought. Emily couldn't help but feel the tension radiating off him. He was as much a part of this puzzle as she was, and it was clear the walls were closing in on both of them. "We're close now," Stone said, his voice grim as he stopped pacing. He turned toward Emily, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "But we have to be smart. The people behind this are powerful, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried." Emily nodded, the weight of his words settling deeper. Every second that ticked by brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. She had never been this close to something this dark, this twisted. Her entire world had shifted, and there was no going back. "Who's our lead?" Emily asked, forcing her voice to stay steady despite the rising fear in her chest. Stone didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila folder. He placed it on the table in front of her, sliding it across the surface. Emily hesitated for a moment before opening it, the contents inside immediately catching her attention. The first page was a photograph of Caroline, her smiling face captured in a moment of vulnerability. Beside it was a handwritten note, scrawled hastily, with the words "she was close." "Too close" underlined in red. "There's more," Stone said. He pointed to the next page, which showed a list of names, some crossed out, others circled in red. There were a few familiar faces, people she had seen around Caroline in news reports or in the files she had reviewed. But one name stood out, a man named William Hawke. The name had no immediate recognition, but the fact that it was highlighted twice piqued her curiosity. "This guy," Stone continued, his voice low, "he's someone with connections, powerful connections. But I'm not sure if he's the one behind this. What I do know is he's been involved in some shady dealings in the past. We need to know more about him, and we need to find out why Caroline was looking into him." Emily absorbed his words, her mind racing. She felt as though a veil was lifting, revealing a path she hadn't considered. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but the picture wasn't clear yet. Stone stood up and moved to the window, peering outside into the darkness. "I've made a call," he said, almost as though speaking to himself. "I'll get some answers about Hawke. But you need to get into Caroline's apartment. We need to see what she left behind. It's our only shot at understanding what she knew." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Caroline's apartment, the place where everything had started, where the woman who had been trying to uncover the truth had ultimately paid the price with her life, felt like stepping into the lion's den. But Stone was right. They couldn't afford to let any lead slip through their fingers. "I'll go," Emily said, her voice unwavering despite the dread creeping into her chest. "But I need to be sure we're not walking into a trap." Stone turned toward her, his eyes sharp. "You won't be alone. I'll have someone watching from a distance. But we can't waste any more time." With that, Emily grabbed her coat and followed him out of the safe house. The streets were quieter now, the usual noise of the city muffled by the rising sense of urgency. The night felt oppressive, as though every shadow held something waiting to spring. The drive to Caroline's apartment was short, but it felt like an eternity. Emily's thoughts were scattered, running in 1,000 directions at once. What had Caroline discovered? Why had she been killed? And why was Emily now thrust into the heart of a conspiracy that had already claimed one life? When they reached the apartment building, the usual buzz of city life seemed far away, replaced by an eerie silence. Stone motioned for Emily to stay behind as he scanned the area, making sure they weren't being watched. He'd done this before. She could see that now, the practiced ease with which he moved, the confidence that came with years of experience. Emily waited by the car, her eyes darting nervously around the street. The darkness felt suffocating, and every passing car, every flicker of movement, made her feel like she was being hunted. When Stone finally gave her the signal, she hurried inside, her pulse pounding in her ears. The building's stairwell was dimly lit, the air stale with the scent of old dust and mildew. As they reached the second floor, Emily felt a growing sense of dread. What if someone was already here? What if they'd been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Stone led the way to Caroline's apartment, his hand poised over the door handle. He checked the lock, then turned to Emily. "Stay close. We'll be in and out quickly." Emily nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead, running through the possibilities of what they might find. The apartment was small, tucked away from the chaos of the city outside. It felt strangely intimate, as though Caroline had been trying to carve out a life for herself in the midst of something dark. Stone pushed the door open, and Emily stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was sparsely furnished, but everything was meticulously arranged. It was the kind of place that suggested someone had tried to live quietly, unnoticed. Emily's gaze fell on the desk, where a pile of files sat neatly stacked. The top file caught her attention immediately. It was labeled Hawk in bold red letters. She walked over to it, her fingers trembling as she opened the file. Inside, there were notes, photographs, and a list of names, all connected to William Hawk. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what Caroline had been trying to do. She had been digging into Hawk's connections, but the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. Caroline had been trying to expose something that went beyond just a single murder. This was about power, corruption, and a network that stretched far beyond what Emily could have imagined as she scanned the pages. One photograph caught her attention, a blurry image of a man in the background, barely visible. But the more she stared at it, the more familiar the face became. "I know him," Emily whispered, her heart racing. He's one of the detectives on the case." Stone's eyes flicked to hers, a flash of realization crossing his face. He moved quickly to her side, his breath quickening. "We need to get out of here, now." Emily felt a rush of panic flood through her. They weren't safe here. Whoever was behind Caroline's murder was closing in, and they had no idea how far the conspiracy went. Before they could make their exit, a loud knock echoed through the door, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Get down," Stone hissed. Emily dropped to the floor, her heart hammering in her chest as the door handle slowly turned. Chapter 7. The walls close in, the The sound of footsteps echoed louder as Emily and Stone crouched low to the ground, their breaths shallow, barely audible. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, and her palms were slick with sweat. Whoever was behind that door knew they were in there, and they weren't leaving without a fight. She could almost feel the danger in the air, thick with tension. Stone moved silently to the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to get a glimpse of the street below. He cursed under his breath when he saw a black SUV parked across the road, its engine running. "They're watching the building," he muttered. "We've got minutes at most." Emily's mind raced. She couldn't help but think about the photograph, the blurry image of the detective she had recognized. Could it really be him? Could one of the very people trying to help her be involved in this twisted web? The thought made her stomach turn, but she had no time to dwell on it. She had to get out. "Back door," Stone whispered, his voice tight with urgency. He grabbed her wrist and tugged her toward the kitchen, where a narrow hallway led to the service entrance. The apartment was eerily silent now, the knock on the door having faded into the background noise of their pounding hearts. Emily followed him without question, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her mind was swirling with too many unanswered questions. Who could she trust now? What was Caroline trying to uncover? And how far did this conspiracy reach? They reached the kitchen, and Stone cautiously opened the back door, checking the alleyway before stepping out. The night air was cool, but Emily felt no relief. Her senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. "Stay close," Stone ordered, his voice low but firm. They moved quickly through the alley, staying close to the walls, blending into the darkness as best they could. Emily's mind was still on the photograph. She had to know who the detective was. There was too much at stake now. As they rounded the corner of the building, Emily froze. In front of them, standing at the entrance to another alley, was a man in a dark suit. His posture was rigid, his face partially obscured by the dim streetlight overhead. But Emily could tell from his stance that he wasn't here by accident. He had been waiting for them. Stone tensed, his hand inching toward his gun. But before he could make a move, the man spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I wouldn't try anything if I were you," he said, the hint of a threat in his words. "The whole block is surrounded." Emily's stomach dropped. They were trapped. "What do you want?" Stone asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're not making any moves unless you tell us what's going on here." The man's lips twitched, as though he was amused by their bravado. "You're digging too deep," he said, his eyes flicking toward Emily. "And she," he paused, a slight sneer curling his lips, "is getting in the way. You have no idea how dangerous this situation is. You think you can keep playing hero, but all you're doing is putting yourselves in harm's way." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what he meant by getting in the way, but the way he looked at her, almost like she was a nuisance, a problem to be eradicated, sent a chill down her spine. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice firmer than she felt. "What do you want with Caroline's investigation?" The man stepped forward, his expression hardening. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice colder now. You're already involved, and there's no way out." Before Emily could respond, a flash of movement caught her eye. A second man appeared from the shadows, this one dressed in tactical gear, his gun drawn. The situation was escalating too quickly. There was no way they could talk their way out of this now. Stone's hand shot up, signaling for Emily to stay behind him. "We'll come with you," he said, his tone defiant. "But you better start talking." The man in the suit smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I thought you'd see reason," he said, then motioned for them to move. "This way. We'll take care of things. You just stay out of our way, and this doesn't have to get messy." The two men led them through the dark streets, away from the apartment building and deeper into the labyrinth of alleyways. Emily's mind raced, searching for a way out, a plan, anything. But all she could think of was the image of the detective in the photograph. Was he involved? Was he one of them? They reached an unmarked van parked in the shadows, its engine running. The man in the suit opened the back door, revealing two more armed men sitting inside. Stone glanced at Emily, his expression unreadable. "We can't let them take us," Emily whispered urgently. "We have to fight back." Stone's gaze softened for a moment. Then he gave her a look of understanding. "Not yet," he said. "We'll get a chance. Just stay calm." Reluctantly, Emily nodded. She had to trust him. For now, she had no other choice. The men pushed them into the van, and the door slammed shut behind them. The vehicle roared to life and sped off into the night, the sound of tires on asphalt a constant reminder of how far they had fallen into the trap as the van navigated the maze of streets. Emily felt a pang of fear creeping up her spine. She had no idea where they were headed or what awaited them. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about Caroline's murder. It was about survival. The walls were closing in, and Emily knew it wouldn't be long before everything came crashing down. Chapter 8. The Edge of Betrayal. The van's wheels screeched against the rough concrete as it took a sharp turn, throwing Emily against the side. The air inside the confined space was thick with tension, and the oppressive silence felt like it might suffocate her. The dim interior, lit only by a single, flickering overhead light, cast long shadows that seemed to move with every bump in the road. Emily's pulse hammered in her chest, each thud amplifying her anxiety. She was no longer just a witness to something she couldn't understand. She was part of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she couldn't afford to let fear take hold. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. Stone sat next to her. His eyes narrowed in concentration, scanning the van's interior for any possible escape. He was calculating, as always, his mind working quickly despite the dire situation. His hand brushed against hers, a silent reassurance, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "Where are they taking us?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. Stone didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked to the men sitting across from them, two of the figures from the alleyway. Both were armed, their eyes trained on the two of them, and yet they remained eerily silent, as if this was just another routine operation. But Emily could sense the danger brewing just beneath the surface, the shifting air between them all. "We'll find out soon enough," Stone muttered, his voice low and controlled. "Just stay alert." The van made another turn, this one slower, as though it was intentionally trying to confuse them. Emily leaned forward slightly, squinting through the darkness. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she pushed the exhaustion aside. Every second counted. Every detail mattered. And then, just as quickly as the van had turned, it slowed to a stop. The sound of the engine dying was almost ominous, and Emily's breath caught. It was quiet now, too quiet. The sound of her own heartbeat filled the space, hammering against her ribs. The door to the van opened, the cold night air rushing in, mingling with the stale scent of metal and sweat inside the van. A man stepped into the vehicle, his silhouette illuminated by the streetlight outside. He was tall, his features sharp and angular. There was a coldness to him, a sense that he was untouchable, and yet his eyes, the eyes that flicked from Stone to Emily, betrayed something else entirely. There was recognition there, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them could ignore. "Out," the man ordered, his voice chilling in its finality. Stone moved first, his hands held slightly out, signaling Emily to follow. As they stepped into the night, Emily's senses were assaulted by the change in the environment. The streets here were different, darker, quieter. They were in an industrial area, far from the comforting lights of the city center. She had no idea where they were, and the isolation only heightened her growing unease. The man led them down a narrow alley to a large, unmarked building. The door to the building creaked open as they approached, revealing a stark, cold interior. It was as if they had entered a forgotten place, one that existed in the shadows. There was no warmth, no humanity in the walls that surrounded them. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She tried to focus on her surroundings, her mind racing. The building was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery that seemed to vibrate the very air. She caught sight of a few men milling about, their eyes scanning her and Stone with suspicion, but none of them moved to stop them. The man who had led them inside stepped forward, motioning for them to sit at a long steel table in the center of the room. He didn't sit. He only stood at the head of the table, watching them both with cold, calculating eyes. His presence was imposing, as though every movement was deliberate, every word planned. "You're here because you've crossed a line," he said, his voice echoing in the silence of the room. "You've gotten too close to the truth, and now you're both going to learn the consequences of that." Stone didn't flinch. Emily could feel the tension in him, the way his jaw tightened and his fists clenched beneath the table. But he didn't speak. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of knowing how much he was affecting them. Emily felt the weight of his words. "What truth?" she demanded, her voice rising despite her fear. "What are you hiding? What does Caroline's death have to do with any of this?" The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Caroline?" he said, almost as though the name were foreign to him. "Caroline's death is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. You've been looking in all the wrong places." Stone's expression remained unreadable, but Emily could sense the change in him. Something about the way the man had said, "You've been looking in all the wrong places," struck a chord, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A door opened, and a new figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a suit. His eyes locked onto Emily immediately, and for a split second, she froze. There was something about him, something familiar. His presence seemed to stir something deep inside her. "Didn't expect you to be here," Stone said, his voice cool, though Emily could sense the underlying tension. The man in the suit nodded slightly, but his expression remained impassive. "I thought it was time we had a conversation," he said. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for them to sit down. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice sharp. "There are things you don't understand. But you're about to." Emily's mind raced. Who was this man? Why did he seem to know everything about them? And most importantly, how much longer would they be able to keep their grip on the truth before it slipped away forever? Chapter 9. Fractured Realities. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in on Emily as she sat across from the man in the suit. She could hear the faint hum of machinery in the background, the steady buzz that had become the soundtrack of her fear. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was no longer just a witness to a crime. She was entangled in something far larger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The man in the suit, his face calm, unreadable, studied her with a detached curiosity. His eyes were like ice, their coldness sending a chill down her spine. Despite the calm exterior, there was something unsettling about him, a presence that seemed to twist the very air around him. "You've been asking the right questions," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "But you've been asking the wrong people." Emily's pulse quickened as she shifted in her seat. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever he was about to say, but she knew that the truth, whatever it was slipping out of her grasp. She had to keep pushing forward. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. "What do you want with me?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Who I am doesn't matter," he replied, his tone cold and almost dismissive. "What matters is that you've gotten too close to something you don't fully understand. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous it becomes." Stone shifted beside her, his gaze never leaving the man. "Cut the theatrics," he muttered, his voice low but steady. "You know exactly what she wants to know. Just give her the answers." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, his smile widening just slightly. "Stone," he said, the name rolling off his tongue like an old, familiar melody. "You always were the impatient one." He turned back to Emily, his eyes narrowing. "But patience has its rewards." The tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating. Emily could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a silent pressure that seemed to pull her into a deeper web of confusion. She didn't know if she was ready for the answers, but there was no turning back now. She had to know. "Caroline?" she whispered, the name heavy on her tongue. "What happened to her? What does she have to do with any of this?" The man's smile faded slightly, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that wasn't quite human. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same impassive mask he wore before. "Caroline was just the beginning," he said softly, his words sending a chill through Emily. "She was expendable, a pawn in a game that's much larger than you realize." "What game?" Emily pressed, leaning forward, her voice rising. "What are you trying to protect?" The man let out a low sigh, almost as if he were tired of the charade. "You've been looking in all the wrong places," he repeated, his voice becoming more insistent. "The people you think you can trust, they're the ones you should be afraid of." Emily's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of what he was saying. The people she thought she could trust? Was he talking about Stone? About her colleagues? Or was he speaking of someone else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at her insides, but she couldn't afford to let it show. Before she could ask another question, the door to the room opened with a soft creak. A new figure stepped inside, and Emily's stomach dropped when she saw who it was. Detective Harper. He walked into the room with a purposeful stride, his face as unreadable as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of regret, perhaps, or guilt, that Emily hadn't noticed before. The sight of him sent a shock wave of recognition through her. The detective had been part of the investigation from the very beginning. He was supposed to be the one she could trust. But now, as he stood there in the same room as the man in the suit, Emily realized the terrible truth. She wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. "Harper?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What is going on? What are you all hiding from me?" The detective's gaze flicked to the man in the suit, a brief, almost imperceptible exchange between them. Emily could feel the weight of the unspoken conversation hanging in the air. Then, Harper turned back to her, his expression cold and distant. "You've gotten yourself involved in something you don't understand," he said, his voice low, almost pitying. "You need to stop asking questions. It's too late for you." Emily's heart sank, the words cutting through her like a knife. "What do you mean, too late?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening here, Harper? What aren't you telling me?" Harper didn't answer. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his face as unreadable as stone. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating, until the man in the suit spoke again. "It's over, Emily," he said, his voice final, like the closing of a door. "You've been asking the wrong questions, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." Emily's world seemed to spin out of control. Everything she thought she knew was shattering before her eyes. Her trust in the people around her had crumbled, and with it, her sense of security. The man in the suit stepped closer to her, his shadow looming over her like a dark cloud. "There's only one thing you need to understand," he said softly. "You're not the first person to get too close, and you won't be the last." With that, the door to the room slammed shut, plunging Emily into darkness once again. Chapter 10. The Last Witness. The cold air outside bit into Emily's skin as she stepped into the alley, the weight of the silence pressing against her ears. The city felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Everything had changed in the past few days. Her world had been upended, shattered like glass, and now there was no turning back. She had trusted the wrong people. She had asked the wrong questions. And now there was no one left to turn to. Her mind raced as she walked through the darkened streets, the alleys and buildings feeling like a maze she could never escape. The man in the suit, Detective Harper, both had been playing her all along. The pieces of the puzzle she had been collecting, the clues that seemed to lead somewhere, had all been carefully placed to manipulate her. She had been a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. The sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She turned, but saw nothing but shadows. Her heart hammered in her chest as the fear settled back in. She had no allies left, no one she could trust. The people she had once relied on had betrayed her, and now she was the last piece in a dangerous puzzle. Emily. The voice sliced through the darkness, and she spun around, her eyes wide. Detective Harper stood a few feet away, his face pale under the streetlights. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different about him now, something she couldn't quite place. Guilt? Remorse? Or was it just more of the same? "Harper," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. "I don't know who you are anymore." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted you to get caught up in this mess." Emily swallowed, trying to push back the surge of emotion rising in her chest. "Then why did you do it? Why did you lie to me? You told me you'd protect me. You said you'd help me find the truth." Harper sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "The truth? It's not what you think. It never was. You think you've uncovered something big, something that could bring down the whole system, but you're wrong. You're just a piece of the puzzle, Emily. A small part of something much bigger." Emily's mind raced, the words crashing through her like a wave. "What do you mean? What's the point of all of this? What do they want with me?" Harper took another step forward, his face drawn in pain. "They don't want you, Emily. They wanted your story. They needed you to see what you saw, to make you think that you could do something about it. But you're not meant to be the hero. None of us are." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent weeks digging, uncovering, hoping that somehow she could expose the truth and bring justice. But now it seemed as though it was all for nothing. The world she thought she understood was slipping through her fingers, and nothing she had done could stop it. "You're telling me," she began, her voice faltering, "that everything I've seen, everything I've uncovered, was part of some plan? They wanted me to see it, to lead me here." Harper's silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say anything more. "Why?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why me?" Harper hesitated, then looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Because you were the last witness, the only one who saw it all, the crime, the cover-up, the conspiracy. And now, you're the only one left who can stop it." Emily's heart raced as the realization hit her. She wasn't just the last witness. She was the key. She had been brought into this web of lies for a reason, and now she was being asked to decide whether or not she would unravel it all. "You have to make a choice," Harper said, his voice low and steady. "You can walk away, disappear, and live the rest of your life in fear, knowing that the truth will never see the light of day. Or you can expose it all. Take down the people who have been pulling the strings from the shadows, no matter the cost." Emily's mind whirled with the weight of the decision. The choice was hers, but she knew that there was no easy way out. She couldn't walk away, not after everything she had uncovered. She had come too far, and the truth was too dangerous to leave buried. "I'll expose them," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "I won't let this go on any longer." Harper nodded, his face grim. "Then we have to move quickly. There's no time to waste. You can't trust anyone, especially me. The only way to do this is to act alone." The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for so long still lingered, but there was something else now, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just running anymore. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. Emily had become something more. "Let's do it," she said, the words feeling like a promise. "Let's bring them down." Harper turned and began walking away, and Emily followed him into the night, her mind racing with the plan they would put into motion. She didn't know what the future held, or whether she would make it out alive. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let anyone get away with murder. Not anymore. As the city lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the streets, Emily took a deep breath. Her story was just beginning, and this time she would write it herself. The end was near, but the truth, it would never be silenced.